All right, perfect. So just to briefly recap where we're at, what we've got left. Obviously, things are winding down very quickly. This week, we need to finish up diabetes, get through cardiovascular disease, and hopefully start stress. We'll do our best, but we definitely need to make sure that we finish cardiovascular disease this week. Stress profiles are due Friday. 4 o'clock would be great. There's an activity of the week that also closes Friday. As I mentioned, that quiz is test questions, so make sure that you guys go through those, write those down. You're not great on your performance on the quiz per se, but obviously, like I said, there's no secret that those will be directly on your final test. So make sure you get them done, make sure you're best prepared to answer them correctly. In a perfect world, both in the quiz and on the final test. But if you find those questions challenging, let's do our best to make sure we're a little bit better prepared come the end of the semester. The following week is activity log 3. So with activity log 3, I've had a couple students email those to me ahead of time. My only concern is that if you're sending me an activity log, your activity log 3, and telling me whether you met your goals or didn't meet your goals, and or doing activities 2 weeks from now, that's kind of defeating the purpose of the whole activity, right? So we need to make sure that from a validity standpoint that we're recording those activities as they are completed, and planning to get X, Y, and Z done next week makes me question as per if that is actually going to be done or not. So if you are handing in that activity log early, make sure that you have adequate number of submissions or entries, and make sure that they obviously were definitely completed. If you haven't gotten full marks on either one of the first two, definitely be sure to review that feedback, okay? So some people are still struggling with what is a SMART goal. If you have questions about that and you want to chat about that directly, then we can make plans to do so as well. Just send me an email and we can organize a quick Zoom meeting to go from there. All right, so no activity of the week next week, just activity logs 3. And then for the final test, I will send out an email just formalizing this, but my plan is that the Monday group, what do we have here in the chat? Did you post the due dates in Moodle? John Ross, so this is posted in Moodle. Okay, so if you go on the meta page, you'll see as of March 23rd, updated weekly breakdown, all of this is posted. Okay, that's been up there for a couple weeks. So if you need to double check anything, all that is listed. I will send out a plan for the final test. I would like anybody who has practical on Mondays to be writing their test Monday afternoon at 1:30, and anybody who has practical on Fridays will be writing their test Friday morning at 9:30. So that is my hope. If there are alternative arrangements that need to be made for that, then we can look at that on a case-by-case basis, but I would like the two sections split up according to when their typical practical would be. Okay. Any questions about where we're at in terms of what we have due coming up? Stress profile, activity of the week quiz this week, activity log next week, and then our test the final week.
So this is our last Zoom lecture?
No, so we've got cardiovascular disease and stress. So we have to finish diabetes, get through cardiovascular disease, start stress. Next week we'll have that. We have to get, next week's might be a couple minutes longer because we need to get through complete stress and cancer in order to make sure you guys are best prepared for the test. And then the test will be the following week on what is listed as the testing week. Okay, all good? All right. Let's go back up here. Slideshow. All right, so to briefly recap where we finished up last week, right? We know the 4 major types of diabetes. This would make a great matching question for the purpose of a test. Type 1, we're not really sure of what the cause is. Typically occurs within the first 2 decades of life, but not always. Type 2, lifestyle factors are the major contributor in terms of the likeliness of developing type 2 diabetes. So we know that decisions we make every day, physical activity, what we're putting into our bodies, are our primary factors when we look at the likeliness of either developing type 2 diabetes or hopefully not developing type 2 diabetes. Gestational diabetes, temporary condition that arises during pregnancy and resolves after delivery, but it is also a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, meaning that if we have gestational diabetes, we are more likely woman is more likely to develop type 2 diabetes later on in life, and prediabetes. So that last point in the road where that doctor is going to say to you, hey, we need to start taking this a little bit more seriously and make those changes, because we know that once somebody becomes diabetic, it is just managing diabetes as opposed to curing diabetes. We did touch on type 2 diabetes and how important it is to be mindful of this, especially with young children, because we know that as Canadians or people around the world are becoming less and less active and more sedentary, putting everybody at greater risk for developing chronic diseases such as diabetes, right? So when we're not setting good examples for our children, we know that it's more and more likely that they are to develop type 2 diabetes at a younger and younger age, and that's super scary. I'm gonna close this. I'm gonna show you guys that video. So only, I think I had 57 students went through the animation, so the activity of the week from last week. So I'm gonna play the video just briefly outlining this as a whole. Hopefully you guys can get my audio here. If this will let me do this. Can you guys hear this? Someone give me a thumbs up in the chat if you can hear the audio.
No, we can't hear it.
You can't hear it?
No.
Okay, hold on a sec. Let's try if I do that.
Food is broken down in the form of glucose
What
to
about now?
accumulate in the blood,
now.
used as fuel by the cells in our body. When we eat, food is broken down by our digestive system into nutrient molecules that are then absorbed through our digestive tract for use by the body. Foods containing carbohydrates or various sugars are broken down into glucose. Glucose is an important source of fuel for many organs in our body. However, to be able to use the glucose for fuel, the glucose molecule must first enter into the cell. The pancreas produces a hormone called insulin, a chemical messenger essential for the entry of glucose into cells. As the blood glucose levels rise after a meal, insulin is released into the bloodstream and sets processes in motion to trigger the removal of glucose from the blood to enter into the cells. In type 2 diabetes, the cells become resistant to insulin and ignore its message to absorb glucose. This is known as insulin resistance. In addition, in type 2 diabetes, the pancreas is unable to produce the greater amounts of insulin needed to trigger these resistant cells to take in glucose from the bloodstream. The most notable symptom of diabetes is frequent urination and excessive thirst. Other symptoms include weakness, drowsiness, and blurred vision. These are caused by chemical imbalances in the blood related to high levels of blood glucose. About 1 in 4 people with type 2 diabetes are unaware that they have the disease. It is important to catch diabetes early. Over time, high blood glucose damages the blood vessels, which can damage the organs that these vessels supply, leading to a variety of health complications. Damage to the small or micro blood vessels can cause vision problems, including loss of sight, nerve damage, and kidney disease. Damage to larger or macro blood vessels can lead to cardiovascular complications such as heart disease, stroke, and poor blood circulation. Overweight and inactivity are major causes of diabetes. A family history of diabetes significantly increases your risk of developing the disease. Certain ethnic populations are also at increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Finally, some medications may increase your diabetes risk, specifically corticosteroids, thiazide diuretics, drugs used to treat certain mental illnesses, and some antiretrovirals used to treat HIV infection. In summary, type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disorder. It causes sugar in the form of glucose to accumulate in the blood rather than being used as fuel for the cells in our body. If not diagnosed and treated in a timely manner, type 2 diabetes can lead to many health complications.
All right. Close that down. So a lot of that should be review based off what we touched on last week and what we had mentioned when we talked about carbohydrates, specifically simple carbohydrates, and the risks that are relevant when my body isn't either producing adequate amounts of insulin and or the cells become less and less receptive to the insulin that is being produced. So super important that we are mindful of that. And for the purpose of a test, it'd be great if we could outline typical digestion for someone who is healthy as opposed to someone who is diabetic, right? So we know that what that normal pathway looks like for someone who isn't diabetic in comparison to somebody who is diabetic, right? So just make sure you guys review that before the last week of the semester. Risk factors associated with diabetes. So you're going to see a lot of these risk factors listed here for diabetes, and you're going to see them repeated again with cardiovascular disease. There is a lot of crossover when we think of someone who has one health condition. They tend to have more than one health condition because so many of those risk factors are either the same and or very closely related. So if we look at risk factors associated with diabetes, being 40 years of age or older, so like we said, type 2 typically takes place later on in life because we know that we continue to abuse the pancreas, right, with all those big spikes in insulin that's being produced by the pancreas, and over time we just wear it out, right? And we can think of the pancreas or the heart no different than a car engine. When if you have a 5-speed car and you never go above third gear and you're driving at RPMs that much higher than what you should be, right? Over time, that's going to have some pretty major effects on our pancreas and or our heart, which we're going to talk about next once we finish up diabetes. Being overweight, having a sedentary lifestyle. These two can almost go hand in hand, right? When we know that if somebody is sedentary meaning not very active, they are definitely more likely to become overweight. So we can look at those two kind of paired related back to physical activity. Belonging to high risk groups, high family history, right? We touched on that as a major risk factor for type 1 diabetes, but we also know it's important to be mindful of that for type 2. History of diabetes during pregnancy, so gestational diabetes, high cholesterol, impaired glucose tolerance, and high blood pressure. So once again, we can look at things like high cholesterol. We know that people with high cholesterol are typically consuming diets that are high in saturated and or trans fats. With that, we know that somebody's more likely to be overweight, and or somebody who's sedentary is also more likely to have higher blood pressure. There's a lot of correlation between all of these risk factors, and it's super important that we're mindful of the fact that risk factors that we have control over and doing our best to make sure that we are making those good choices. For the uncontrollable risk factors, such as things like family history, or belonging to a certain high risk group, it's imperative that we are much more mindful of the other risk factors that we do have control over to make sure that we live the healthiest lifestyle as possible, because we're already kind of behind the 8 ball in a sense of if you're born with, like I mentioned, the high family history of diabetes, that was outside of your control. But it is another thing that we need to be mindful of when we look at those decisions we make on a daily basis to try to decrease the risk of developing type 2. Hold on, we got 4 bites here in the chat. All right, 4 bites are from Ben. All in accent, that's all good. All right, moving forward here. Hypo or hyperglycemia. So hypoglycemia, just think of like hypothermia. That means our blood sugar is very low. So glycemia being the core word here when we look at blood sugar. Hypo meaning low. So symptoms include shakes, sweating, trembling, dizziness, irritability, confusion, blurred vision, and hunger. Hypoglycemia is something that the majority of you have experienced at one point or another. So if anybody's ever exercised or played a sport or gone for a big hike or canoeing or anything like that, any sort of major major prolonged period of moderate to vigorous physical activity, you've probably felt that lightheaded or that irritability or that, that slight dizziness, profuse sweating and whatnot, just because we don't have enough carbohydrates present, carbohydrates broken down into glucose readily available to the muscle. We don't have enough present. So even maybe some of you could have even happened in fitness class or while you're at the gym, right? As you feel lightheaded, dizzy, typically after fairly vigorous exertion. But we do know that, have a Gatorade or something with some sugar in it will help us feel better right away. So that's why if anybody's ever, if you're going out on a big canoe trip or a big hike or whatever else, hikes are pretty popular right now with everything that's going on. It's important that you are packing things that have carbohydrates readily available. And if we look at from a recovery standpoint for the purpose of regulating blood sugar levels, if you reach this point, strongly recommended that you are consuming simple carbohydrates, right? I need to get that energy to the body as quickly as possible. So things like fruit juice, candy, Gatorade, even pop, for the sake of making sure that somebody's blood sugar levels come back to a safe and reasonable level. Any sort of simple carbohydrate that we can consume will definitely help with that. Hyperglycemia is something that most of you probably have not experienced. So hyper meaning higher than what they should be blood sugar levels. So symptoms include increased thirst, dry mouth, frequent urination, nausea, vomiting, shortness of breath, and fatigue. We know that hyperglycemia typically only exists when my body isn't producing adequate amounts of insulin in order to be able to extract the glucose from the bloodstream. So hypo can be fairly common, no major health risks in the long term. When we think of hypoglycemia, right, you have that sugar, you get back to normal and move forward. Hyperglycemia, on the other hand, though, that is something that we tend to see experiencing these symptoms if we are diabetic. So much less common. As mentioned with my friend there as the example last week, who's type 1 diabetic and how he found out about it. Our doctor's major concern is that he was, hyperglycemia in its most full extent can actually lead to loss of consciousness. So when I gave you guys that example of, they told him not to drive and he needed to call an ambulance and get to the hospital as quickly as possible. His numbers came back from that blood sugar test so high that they were worried about worst case scenario. And like I said, him losing consciousness and whatnot. So definitely something to be mindful of. Big takeaway from a daily activity standpoint: hypoglycemia. If you're being active and you haven't eaten for a while or haven't specifically had carbohydrates for an extended period of time, super important to make sure we have simple carbohydrates readily available in order to get us feeling better quicker. So I touched on the fact that we know that diabetes, there is no cure, but there is the fact that people become better and better at managing diabetes. When we think of somebody who's living with diabetes, these are very extreme examples. Some of you, if you have friends, family members, maybe grandparents that are diabetic, probably have heard about the special socks in relationship to circulation, right? So we know that the blood vessels don't typically circulate oxygenated blood as well as they should, and there are major implications that can take place from a health standpoint if we aren't mindful of that. This is kind of an old school picture, right? We know that now a lot more people, you'll see people, it almost looks like a patch, and they'll wear it on their shoulder, and I think there's even an app on your phone that they just hold their phone and or their device over top of that patch, and we'll tell them what their blood sugar is. Obviously much less invasive, much better than, I always remember my grandma having to, prick her finger before and after meals to check her blood sugar. We know that now technologies came a long way. So that's great news for those that are living with diabetes. On that note, when we think of how far technology's come, is that some of you may know somebody who uses a pump. So instead of having to withdraw insulin and do regular injections in order to help manage their blood sugar levels, they actually have a pump, little needle that goes into the abdomen, and they can measure their blood sugar and then just press button whether they need more or less based off what their score is for their blood sugar, and manage that accordingly. So a little less invasive, obviously, instead of having to, carry a variety of syringes and needles and whatnot. But these devices are extremely expensive. So I think a buddy of mine that I play hockey with said that his machine costs like $5,000. So that would definitely be a negative in the grand scheme of things. But like I said, when somebody's diagnosed with diabetes, and especially for when we think of younger people and how many more younger people are developing the condition, having something like this is much more ideal for that, could be 10-year-old boy or girl who's type 2 diabetic, as opposed to having to, teach them on how to do proper injections. This would be much more optimal. So like I said, diabetes, in the grand scheme of things, we're definitely just looking at becoming better at managing the condition, because currently we do not have a cure. Any questions about diabetes? How are we doing here? How's the chat? Are we all good? No complaints? Awesome. Okay, so moving forward, cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease is an umbrella term that we can look at any disease that is in relationship to the heart. Let's click that. See, there we go. So we're going to talk about three major types of cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease applies to any disease that affects the heart or blood vessels. First being atherosclerosis, second being coronary heart disease, and third being stroke. So we're going to break down each of these in a little bit greater detail, but definitely we need to make sure that we can differentiate between all three of these different types of cardiovascular disease. So when you think of cardiovascular disease, and the risk factors that go along with it, right? Risk factors being something that increase the likeliness of me developing that chronic condition or acute condition for that matter. It's very important that we can differentiate between a risk factor and a symptom. Okay, so if I was to ask you on a test to outline 4 risk factors for cardiovascular disease, which I very well might do, regardless whether they're uncontrollable or controllable, these are things that impact the likeliness of me developing cardiovascular disease as a whole, the likeliness of me developing diabetes as a whole, okay? Symptoms is an example we're going to get into in a little bit greater detail, because when we think of, symptoms being things that we experience that help tell us that we're actually have that condition, right? When we think of symptoms of a heart attack, right? We know chest pain, being the major one, clamminess, profuse sweating. We're going to talk about them in a little bit greater detail, as opposed to stroke and the symptoms that go along with stroke, which are obviously much different than having a heart attack. We definitely do need to know the difference between a risk factor and a symptom, because they are not the same. And like I said, risk factors, some of which we have control over, so being blood pressure, exercise, smoking and drinking, and healthy diet, as opposed to uncontrollable risk factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, and family history, right? I know that the older I am, the more likely I am to have any sort of health-related condition. And I also know that I can't slow that down in a certain, right? I'm 30 now, turn the big 30, so I need to be mindful of the fact that I'm not a young pup anymore. And unfortunately, I don't have control over that. But I do know that I do have control over things like blood pressure, exercise, my body weight, smoking and drinking, and or what I'm consuming from a nutrition standpoint. So we should be able to differentiate between controllable and uncontrollable risk factors. And we should definitely be mindful of all these, because just like diabetes, we know that more and more people, unfortunately, are having heart-related complications as the days go on here. So the heart is designed to circulate oxygen-rich blood throughout the body. However, the heart is a muscle and it also needs oxygen as well too, right? So when we think of the importance of cardiovascular exercise, it's super important to be mindful of the fact that that's why, cardio or, doing moderate to high intensity, large muscle activity for extended periods of time, the heart is a muscle. We need to make the heart stronger. And when the heart is stronger, it becomes much more efficient. So if anybody's ever measured their resting heart rate, which all of us have done when we did the fitness profile, we know that if, let's use Trent as an example and Thomas as an example, and Trent's in really good shape. He spends a lot of time exercising aerobically, 10, 15, 20 plus minutes, moderate to high intensity, whether it be cycling, jogging, whatever, rowing, canoeing, whatever that may be, is that we're placing adequate stimulus to the heart and getting it stronger, right? And training the heart is no different than training a bicep or training a quadricep or a calf or chest, whatever that may be. We need to apply greater amounts of stimulus over extended periods of time to make that muscle stronger. So we've got Trent, who spends lots of time on cardiovascular fitness. And we've got Thomas, who spends no time on cardiovascular fitness, or Thomas, who doesn't spend any time exercising as a whole, right? I know that Trent is going to be able to circulate his oxygenated blood throughout the body in in fewer beats per minute as opposed to Thomas. So if Trent's resting heart rate is 52 beats per minute and my resting heart rate is 82 beats per minute, that means that Trent can meet the needs of his body with his heart only contracting 52 times in 1 minute. Okay, pretend this is a heart contracting. Okay, as opposed to me or Thomas, this hypothetical Thomas, right, who doesn't exercise, isn't physically active, right? My heart has to beat like this. Okay, so I know that if my heart's beating on average 30 more times per minute, I know that that's like driving our car at higher RPMs, right? That's like driving in fourth gear instead of sixth gear when you're going 80 kilometers an hour or 100 kilometers an hour, whatever that may be. And over time, that is definitely a major concern. So we know that resting heart rate is actually an indicator of heart health because of what is called stroke volume. So stroke volume is the volume of oxygenated blood that my heart can extract every time that it contracts. And somebody who has a higher stroke volume, their heart is much more efficient. Therefore, in turn, their heart doesn't have to work as hard because every time it contracts, it's pushing more oxygenated blood throughout the body as opposed to somebody who isn't quite as fit. So we know that resting heart rate is a major indicator of heart health as a whole. So if that's something that anybody wants to work on, make sure you're spending time moderate to high intensity, physical activity, major muscle groups. Sorry, I forgot this little bad boys here. These arteries supply the heart muscle with blood. So we'll talk about the arteries a little bit more in a second. Uh-oh, hold on, give me half a second here. I opened the or the student version. Anybody has any questions, that'd be a good time to ask them. Don't see. All right, I'm just gonna fire this share back up here. Sorry about that, everyone. Current slide. There we go. That should be a little bit easier for you guys. So atherosclerosis can be defined as narrowing or hardening of the arteries in the body, which restricts blood flow to vital organs, a progressive disease that may start in childhood. And the fatty arterial blockages called plaque are typically composed of cholesterol, cellular debris, and calcium. So cholesterol being a major one here, right? When we talked about fats and the importance of both good fats and how we want to be mindful about limiting the bad fats that we're consuming. Cholesterol is a major factor when we look at what is called plaque buildup. Okay, and I'm going to get to an image here in a second. So a narrowing or hardening of the arteries or the arterial walls, which restricts blood flow to the vital organs. So not only can we look at the artery itself and the space that has. Here, I'm going to use my coffee cup. Okay, so if this is my coffee cup here, can you guys see that? There we go. So if this is an artery, right, when we think of atherosclerosis, that plaque buildup affects the area in which the oxygenated blood is traveling through. I was actually gonna bring in the hose, but I didn't think my wife was gonna like that. From an example standpoint, right, anybody who's ever tried to water their garden, right, and their hose won't reach any further, right? We've all done this, right? So our hose won't reach any further. how do we get the water further? If I'm, I'm trying to, like I said, I'm trying to water the garden. My hose is cranked up full pop. It's just running out straight out the spout, and the water's 10 feet short, right? How do we increase that pressure in order to make that water travel further, right? We put our thumb over the end of the hose. Well, same thing can be said. I don't know if this is going to work with this. There we go. Same thing can be said if we have that blockage and I have the same volume of water trying to get through what was this big, which is now this big due to the blockage. I know that the water that's traveling through that hose, or the blood that's traveling through that artery, is traveling through at a much greater pressure. And although that's a great way to try to help water your flowers or water your vegetables, it's not so good when we think of when that water is traveling through in comparison to the same thing being the oxygenated blood traveling through, is that is in relationship to our blood pressure, right? And we know that elevated blood pressures, especially for extended periods of time, aren't a good thing, right? We know it's a major health risk that goes along when we think of proper heart health and whatnot. So there are two types of plaque. Hard plaque causes the arterial walls to thicken and harden, and then soft plaque. So this is, pretend this little yellow step here is the plaque, right? And we'll use this diagram here because it's a little bit more thorough as opposed to me trying to hand talk about the width of hoses and whatnot. But it's an easy visualization for all of you to be mindful of the fact of, like, hey, when that plaque buildup takes place, right, and we have to get the same amount of water through that space in which it was before, when we have that plaque buildup, or the equivalent of that being putting our thumb over the end of the hose, right, we can all visualize the impact that has on our bodies when we think of blood traveling through that space, and the increased pressure and the risk that may go along with that. One thing that's a little bit scary about soft plaque is the fact that it is more likely to break apart off the walls, and I will explain why that is a little bit scarier when we talk about stroke. What's up in the chat? Not sure where I came to the chat to open here. Are we good? I'll come back to that after if we need to. If you had the question in the chat, I'm not quite sure why it's not opening, but you can try to post it again, and I'll see if I can get it to open this time.
Someone said, could someone remove plaque with physical fitness and with better nutrition?
We know that I don't know the exact question or the exact answer to that. But when we think of the importance of obviously trying to be proactive in all of this, right? I mean, one thing would be is that if we did have major plaque buildups, we can improve on those in the grand scheme of things, because our bodies, right, when we think of the plaque buildup on the arterial walls, right, they actually lose the elasticity. Okay, so there are some health concerns that go along with that. In a perfect world, considering most of you are young and hopefully fairly active and took Fit 1115, is that we don't reach that point of plaque. If we do have plaque buildup as it is now, it's not to the extent that it's alarming for our health by any means. So just being mindful of being physically active, making proper nutritional choices whenever we can, and being proactive about that is optimal. But I'm not exactly sure what we can do in terms of reversing the effects of what may already be present. Does that make sense? Sorry, I can't answer that a little bit better. Coronary heart disease. Fatty deposits block one or more coronary arteries, so the arteries supplying blood to the heart. Insufficient oxygen reaching the heart muscle causes chest pain or angina pectoris. Okay, so as we mentioned a few minutes ago, right, the heart is a muscle no different than the bicep, no different than the quadricep, no different than the pec. And if there is inadequate oxygenated blood getting to the muscle, that's a major concern, and no different than the brain. And we're going to talk about the brain in a second when we get to stroke. But what this leads to is myocardial infarction. So MI is just a fancy way of saying heart attack. So anybody who watches Grey's Anatomy, right, has probably heard of the term referenced MI, myocardial infarction. That's just the medical term for heart attack. And we know that heart attacks occur when oxygen can't get past the blockage, and then in terms the muscle is damaged. So I'm going to close this for a second and create a little image here for you guys. So I'm going to go to new share. I go to whiteboard. All right, so I'm going to draw let's use red as an example. So we can use the same example here for hearts and or brains. So I need you guys to be mindful of this. So if this is, let's pretend that these are the vessels of the heart. Okay, so just picture it as a tree, right? Pretend that's connected there. Right? Does that kind of look like a tree? That looks like a heart, eh? Not bad. And if this is our heart, let's look at this. There we go. That'll be an easy way for you guys to remember this. And I have a blockage that occurs, and we know that with heart attacks and strokes, unfortunately, there are varying degrees, right? So one of the big things being is that, you know, some people have a heart attack, return to, you know, levels of physical activity that they were doing beforehand. They survive the heart attack, and that's great. And unfortunately, we know that some people have more serious heart attacks. And when we think of one of the major factors as per why there are such varying degrees of stroke and varying degrees of heart attacks, two main factors are how long the blockage occurs for and where that blockage takes place. Okay, so I'm going to use an example here in yellow. An example one, okay, is that this person has a heart attack and the blockage occurs here. Okay, so the part of the tree or the part of the heart that's affected is very small, right? The only part that is dying, so to speak, that's not getting adequate oxygen is the part here circled in black, right? It's just like snapping the branch off a tree, right? If it's a little wee twig and it's snapped off, that tree is going to be okay, right? It's very minuscule in comparison to somebody who may have more serious blockage. And let's go to, let's think of this part of the tree. Okay, so this is where my blockage occurs here, for example, 2. And I think of how much, how large of a piece of the heart that is affected by this blockage here, because the oxygenated blood traveling through this branch, we'll say, or this limb of the tree, and all these branches are now affected, right? All these branches, for the visualization of the tree, or for the sake of the heart, all these blood vessels are now not receiving adequate oxygen. So unfortunately, when we look at risks and how that may impact the cells that aren't receiving adequate amounts of oxygen, these effects are much more major, right? Based on the fact that there's so many more vessels that aren't receiving adequate oxygen, and the risks that go along with that, and those cells ultimately die, and we can look at major repercussions. And you know, this is one of the major factors that differentiate the varying degrees of heart attacks. When we talk about stroke here, which is going to be our next topic, the same thing can be said, right? When we think of ruptures or blockages, the same thing when we look at varying degrees and where those blockages take place or where those ruptures take place, impact is one of the major factors when we look at how much they're impacted. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? The visualization of the tree should be good. Close this. New share. All right. So symptoms of a heart attack. How are we doing for time? Not too bad. So when we think of symptoms of a heart attack, this is so much more important than the purpose of the course that I can't stress enough how important this is, right? Is that the scary part being is that more and more people are having heart conditions and or heart attacks, right? For a variety of different reasons, stress, physical activity, and all sorts of stuff. When we think of when, you know, I talked about the blockages and where they occur, and how long these blockages occur for, being the two major factors that lead to heart attacks and or strokes being more severe or less severe. It's super important that we're mindful of these symptoms. I had a family friend of ours, it was his brother-in-law, wasn't feeling well after dinner. They were, I think they're on Windy Lake, they're at camp up there. And his wife's like, hey, like, you know, you need to go, like, you know, he had some chest pain, was feeling a little nauseous. It's like, no, it's just indigestion. I just need to have a nap. So anyways, he laid down on the couch. They couldn't talk him into going to the doctors, going to the hospital. Laid down on the couch, got up from his nap, and actually started vomiting. So he was still conscious, started vomiting, went to the bathroom, was sick, came out of the bathroom, was walking through the kitchen and collapsed. And unfortunately, he didn't survive. But when they had called the ambulance shortly after, and the ambulance got there and announced, what had taken place, is that he was actually having a heart attack that entire time. So these symptoms aren't they aren't crystal clear, right? There's not a light that goes off on top of my head that says, hey, you're having a heart attack, you need to act about this. But it is something that we need to be extremely mindful of. And especially if some of you are spending lots of time in remote spaces, right? If I was to ever have a heart attack on the corner of LaSalle and Barrydown, there's a pretty good chance that the paramedics could get there within 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes, right? Help is nearby. If you guys are out at camp or you're hiking or you're hunting's another big one, right? And you're out in the middle of nowhere, and either yourself or you're with a friend or a family member that, maybe has high blood pressure and isn't very physically active. And I'll use the hunting one as an example, right? And now they're out at a hunt camp and they spent all week doing all sorts of work out there, up in the morning, having lots of beers and whatever else, and, not typically eating chicken and salad by any means when you're out at a hunt camp. That if all of these factors kind of snowball, and if somebody is experiencing any of these symptoms, it's important that we act quickly, right? And I know that men stereotypically are very stubborn, I'll say it. But the difference of acting and being proactive, and I would just hate to see anybody ever in this position of what if, right? And I know that for the family friends of ours that I mentioned, that, what if he had listened to his wife, or what if he had listened to the other family members? Sorry, whoever that is, could you make sure you're on mute? And ultimately, he isn't here anymore, and that's sad to say, even though I didn't know him. But what if he had taken the advice of the people around him that said, hey, maybe we should go to the hospital and get this checked? And with so many more people having heart-related conditions, it's imperative that you take this stuff seriously. And it's even more important that we take this stuff seriously if you have other major risk factors, okay? So that's a whole aside that's so much bigger than this course. If you guys do take one thing from this course, I hope that this is it, because not that this is fun stuff to talk about, but it is important to be mindful that being proactive and making choices when there's people around you that have risk factors of major health conditions and or start experiencing symptoms, you're much better off to be too active and be too careful than not so careful enough. We know how serious these conditions can be. So yeah, heavy pressure on the chest can spread to arms, shoulders, neck, jaw. Just explained to me, I used to work in a cardiac rehab program, and it was explained to me that it literally feels like there's a herd of elephants walking on your chest, right? This tightness is severe typically. Shortness of breath, paleness, sweating, nausea, vomiting, indigestion, and anxiety. So definitely make sure that you guys are mindful of this. Those of you that have your first aid CPR would be aware of all this, but you can never take this stuff too seriously, okay? Last but not least, we're going to talk about strokes. So stroke, interruption of blood flow to the brain. So there's two different types of stroke. There's a hemorrhagic, or a hemorrhage, when high blood pressure causes a weakened blood vessel to break in the brain. An ischemic stroke, a blood clot that travels to the brain and blocks the blood supply. So, I talked about that plaque buildup and that the dislodging of that plaque, right? We can use that as an example here of the ischemic stroke, of how that plaque could break away and cause a blockage at any point in the body, whether it's the heart or the brain being our two major concerns there. So for hemorrhage, like I mentioned, that weakened / diseased blood vessel ruptures and the blood leaks into the brain tissue, which we know isn't a good thing. Where that rupture occurs is definitely a major factor in terms of severity, as well as how long the rupture takes place for. No different than that beautiful little tree that I drew you guys for hearts, and the importance and the varying degrees of both stroke and heart attacks. Oh, here we go. Blood clots stop the flow of brain to an area of the brain. So exact same philosophy when we look at the importance of the different types of stroke and where they take place and how important it is to be mindful of acting quickly. Effects of stroke depends on which part of the brain is damaged as well as the duration which it's damaged for. So some common effects include weakness or muscular paralysis, trouble reading, writing, talking, learning new things, retaining information, short-term memory loss, difficulty with decision making, and balance and coordination problems. Some of this can be drastically improved with the help of working with an occupational therapist and whatnot. Like I said, it's one of those things that, I have a friend of ours, I don't need to get into story time, but I have a friend of ours that her mom suffered a stroke 5 years ago, and other than very, very minor remaining effects, you would never know she drives. To have a conversation with her, she went back to work, and she's very fortunate that they acted swiftly when that incident did take place. But we also know that strokes can be deadly, and strokes can leave people having to rely on technology and ventilators and all sorts of stuff like that in order to be alive. So it is important that we are mindful of the varying degrees of stroke. When we think of prevention of cardiovascular disease as a whole, I know it feels like I'm beating a dead horse, but make sure you guys are active, right? And physically active can be different than exercise, right? Physically active is going for a walk to the mailbox or walking to your car or walking upstairs. Exercise is a little bit more planned and structured, but just make sure you guys are moving. And I know that's tougher and tougher with everything that's going on, especially with a lot of people not having access to gyms, but don't sit on your butts, guys. It's too easy to get stuck into a bit of a rut. And, a lot of you have spent a lot more time on your physical fitness in the past, 8 weeks since starting the course than you did beforehand, or maybe had a little break, from when you finished high school or whatever it was that you did upon completing high school before coming to Cambrian, and got away from exercising. But a lot of you have made a lot of really positive changes. So do your best to keep up with that, because a lot of you have spent a lot of hours trying to improve your fitness, and I hate to see that go to waste and have those results kind of deteriorate just because circumstances aren't quite ideal, which we know is the case. Nutrition, summarize foods such as fruits, vegetables, whole grains, those low in saturated and trans fats and sodium, right? So we need to be mindful of how much saturated fats we're consuming, trying to eliminate trans fats if at all possible, and just being mindful of sodium intake. So when I looked at those nutrition profiles, sodium intake was definitely something that was much higher for a lot of you than you probably expected. And we think of the impact that sodium and or salt has on blood pressure. It is super important to be mindful of making sure that we are at least aware of what foods that we normally eat and how much sodium they have, because that is something that tends to sneak up on us fairly quickly. And last but not least, obviously these two in combination with each other, maintaining healthy body weight, specifically in the abdomen. Studies have shown that people who store the majority of their fat in their midsection are at greater health risks for all sorts of different chronic conditions, as opposed to somebody who stores the same amount of fat in something like their arms or their thighs. So waist circumference is important here. We can't control we can't control where we do store our fats, but it is important. One thing that we can obviously control is how much exercise we're doing, and what exactly it is that we're putting in our bodies and whatnot. So these two, I know I've talked about it all semester, but I can't stress it enough. Okay. So, all right. If anybody has any questions, now would be a good time to ask them. We'll leave stress for next week. So next week we'll need to get through stress and cancer. So it may take us a few extra minutes, but I don't see that being an issue. If you don't have any other questions, for the purpose of attendance, what I'm gonna have you guys all do is just post your name down in the chat. And then once your name is posted in the chat, then I can just go through that afterwards once you guys all take off, and just write everybody's name down so I know who was here and who wasn't. If you have any classmates that weren't here, you can remind them that I'll be online Friday morning, 9:30, going over the same material so they can attend then. I will be sure to save this recording, post it on Moodle. So if you need to review it, you can do so. Best prepare for your test. And other than that, I'm going to stop the record and I can answer any questions you may have either via chat or through your microphones.
Hey, Thomas.
Yes. Just give me half.
It's
I'm just
Brady.
gonna. Just give me half a second, okay? I'm just gonna stop the